The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. Europe of 200 years ago was a wildly different place than it is now. The world was a much wilder place than it is now. The French Revolution and subsequent Napoleonic Wars would be a tremendous moment not just for European history, but world history. In a span of 20 years, the social and political order of the continent would be swept away. The year is 1789. The early modern period is coming to an end. The age of mercantilism is alive, and the large European powers have established colonies across the world. These powers have now fought numerous continent-wide, sometimes intercontinental, destabilizing wars. The most recent, the Seven Years' War, has helped propel Britain to premier naval and colonial status, at the expense of France's overseas colonial holdings and their economy. The following American Independence War would also financially burden France. France, unlike some of its neighbors, still retains an incredibly aristocratic and absolutist political system, one of the harshest in Western Europe. The economic crisis culminated in the French Revolution of 1789. Liberalism would take hold in France, and the revolution would destroy old feudal systems. The new republic would be a nightmare to the European monarchies across the continent. The fear of revolution spreading to their territories frightened the continent. The reactionary powers would fund exiled royalists and counter-revolutionaries, hoping to squash the infant republic. The French would hold their weak and ineffective monarchy under Louis XVI hostage, and the radicalism of the anti-feudal and anti-religious new state would begin the civil war all throughout the country. France would execute their monarchs for treason and would declare war against the Holy Roman Empire. The French Revolutionary Wars would begin. The war would prove problematic in northern France, but the diversionary invasions throughout the Italian peninsula would be incredibly successful. This was the mastermind of a French Corsican general, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was quickly making a name for himself. The Prussians, British, and Spanish would eventually join the war against the French, but the French would push the German states back and would capture the Netherlands and force the Spanish out of the war. France would set up numerous sister republics in Italy, Germany, and Ireland, hoping to spread the ideals of the revolution all throughout the world. The instability of the new republic would be its demise. General Napoleon would lead a failed expedition to Egypt, hoping to disrupt British trade, but when he returned, he and his fellow generals led a coup d'etat against the French government and established a three-person consulate, based on the former Roman Republic. With Napoleon as first consul, he was effectively head of government. In 1799, the French Revolution would come to an end. Napoleon would slowly start to reverse many of the policies of the French Revolution, and destroy the gains of women and slaves especially. But it must be understood that Napoleon's policies would contain much of the same revolutionary principles and ideas. The Napoleonic Code would transform France and all of the conquered and allied territories away from feudalism, and would directly lay the groundwork for the crystallization of capitalism throughout Europe. To see Napoleon as a reactionary would not really be true. To see him as a counter-revolutionary would not really be true. He took power for himself and reversed some policies, yet expanded numerous rights and legal changes. He created civil codes and abolished feudalism. He spearheaded Jewish emancipation, freeing Jews from enforced ghettos across Europe. He secularized many political and educational institutions, among many other policies. Napoleon is a complex figure, but at his worst, he was still better than the European powers that hoped to strangle the revolution and Napoleon's reforms. As a way to simultaneously maintain power and hope to gain recognition among the European monarchies, Napoleon would bring the Pope to Paris and declare himself Emperor of the French. While a monarchy, Napoleon would not return the pre-revolutionary systems and prevented the exiled Bourbon monarchs from returning. France was to be an empire, but a Napoleonic and modern one at that. Never before had one man so thoroughly trampled over the royal and feudal traditions of the European monarchies. The divine right of kings and the royal and regal laws were threatened by the usurper Napoleon. The move would make Napoleon public enemy number one across Europe. War would resume throughout Europe. Napoleon would ally with Spain in a hope to navally challenge the British, hoping to eventually invade the British Isles. This would culminate in the Battle of Trafalgar, where a combined Franco-Spanish fleet would be thoroughly eviscerated by the British and would destroy France's ability to navally accomplish much, while propelling Britain to an unrivaled naval power it would hold for the next 100 years. Despite this setback, on land, Napoleon would become master of the continent. War in Germany would see France annihilate an Austrian army in the Ulm campaign and lead to the Battle of Three Emperors at Austerlitz in modern-day Czechia. Austerlitz would put Napoleon of France against Tsar Alexander of Russia and Francis II of Austria, considered by many to be one of Napoleon's finest achievements. While holding three-fourths of the size of his enemy army, he would kill and capture a third of them combined, while suffering incredibly minor losses. There are many battles of the Napoleonic Wars, and France would easily expand throughout much of the continent, having established power over Europe not seen since the Roman times. France would be at its peak in 1812. The beginning of the end was on its way. Napoleon made two key blunders, Spain and Russia, both of which are caused by Napoleon's continental system, a reaction to British trade and smuggling and previous British embargoes across continents. Napoleon hoped to damage British trade by forcing his puppets and allies to embargo British trade, Britain being the only major power not invaded by France throughout the wars. The policies wrecked the European economies and created distrust and open defiance against Napoleon. Portugal, a longtime British ally, would openly defy the continental system, and Napoleon would invade through allied Spain in 1807. But then, he would invade Spain itself with his troops throughout the country, and would place his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Iberia would become a quagmire, and Napoleon was eventually pushed out of Spain in 1814. The word guerrilla comes from this war, meaning little war in Spanish, owing to the partisan attacks that would cripple France. The next more well-known blunder would be Russia, who by 1812 would slowly remove itself from the continental system. The subsequent invasion by France would be enormous, but would quickly turn into a stalemate and attritional hell for Napoleon. After an enormous and costly battle at Borodino, west of Moscow, Napoleon would capture the undefended Moscow and find it scorched and deserted. Napoleon would retreat with much of his armies in ruins. Napoleon and his armies would retreat back to France and fight many key battles that France would win, but the Allied armies were too numerous and motivated to be stopped. The Battle of the Nations in Leipzig in 1813 would be the major French defeat that would signal the end. Napoleon would continue fighting all the way into France, finally being forced by his generals to sue for peace and abdicate, to avoid Paris being burned and to bring an end to almost 20 years of warfare. In 1815, Napoleon would be exiled to the small island of Elba, off of Italy, but would be allowed to live in peace and retire. The former French monarchy and all its laws and aristocrats would be returned to France under Louis XVIII. The victorious powers would create Europe in their image and attempt to turn the clock back to 1789, despite what 20 years of turmoil and revolution had produced. But that was not the end. While the coalition was in Vienna, creating a new European order, they would hear the news. After nearly a year of exile, Napoleon would escape and head to southern France. The coalition declared him an outlaw, and the French king would send an army to capture him. But this army defected and joined Napoleon, and within weeks he was in Paris, ready to fight another war against the continent. Taking the initiative, he mounted an attack in detail against the British and Prussian armies in Belgium. At Waterloo, Napoleon would make his last stand. However, he would be bested, and slowly his entire campaign would end after 100 days. Napoleon once again abdicated, this time finally to St. Helena off of Africa, where he would die in 1821. Napoleon encapsulated an era and brought forth a new age into the world. The revolution would not fully end in 1799 or 1815. Many of these reforms and changes would directly inspire the generations of the 1848 revolutions and would forever leave their mark on the world. History is a complicated and dramatic process, which is the culmination of many people's activities, efforts, and thoughts that transform society. History isn't great men deciding the present and creating the future. But if there ever was a counterargument to that, Napoleon is the example.